In 1788, France dazzled with contrasts, shimmering silks for nobles, desperate rags for peasants. At its heart stood Versailles, a golden cage for the nobility. Life here was a performance, every day a ballet of ritual and spectacle. King Louis XVI, well-meaning but indecisive, ruled this opulent world. By his side, Marie Antoinette, admired yet blamed for excess. Nobles danced and feasted, oblivious to the storm of revolution gathering outside. Versailles dazzled with luxury, but just beyond its gates, a different France struggled. In Paris and the countryside, most people toiled in poverty, burdened by taxes and hunger. Families like Jean-Pierre's worked endlessly, yet had little to eat and no power. In the city, life was crowded and harsh, with disease and hunger everywhere. Two worlds, one of privilege, one of struggle, existed side by side, divided and uneasy. In 1788, France was bankrupt. Lavish spending, failed reforms, and a disastrous harvest left the people hungry and angry. Enlightenment ideas spread, challenging the old order. King Louis XVI, desperate, summoned the Estates General for the first time in 175 years, giving the people a voice. The stage was set. The French Revolution was about to begin. In 1789, the king's call for the Estates General swept across France, igniting hope and anticipation. For the first time in generations, ordinary people could be heard. Across villages, they wrote their grievances, cahiers de doléances, demanding justice and change. Delegates journeyed to Versailles, carrying the hopes of millions. But the old order expected to dominate, unaware the Third Estate would no longer accept its place. The stage was set for a monumental clash of wills. In May 1789, the Estates General opened at Versailles, reinforcing the old social order. The Third Estate, dressed in black, demanded real representation, but the nobility and clergy refused. Tensions grew as the Third Estate stood firm, inspiring hope and fear across France. In Paris, the people rallied behind them, while in the countryside, hunger and rumors sparked unrest. France was on the brink of revolution. In June 1789, the Third Estate declared themselves the National Assembly, challenging the king's authority. Barred from their meeting hall, they gathered in a nearby tennis court and swore not to disband until France had a constitution. This tennis court oath marked a turning point: unity, defiance, and the birth of the revolution. The National Assembly had won. The National Assembly's victory electrified Paris, but joy quickly turned to suspicion. Rumors spread that King Louis was gathering troops to crush the assembly. When he dismissed the popular minister Necker, the city erupted. Crowds armed themselves, the royal authority collapsed, and Paris was in the hands of its citizens. But to truly arm the revolution, they needed gunpowder at the Bastille. The Bastille was more than a prison. It was a symbol of royal tyranny looming over Paris. Its towers cast a shadow of fear and oppression for centuries. The fortress's dark reputation haunted the city, even as it held only 7 prisoners in 1789. To Parisians, it was the ultimate symbol of oppression and a stockpile of desperately needed gunpowder. On July 14th, a crowd gathered, demanding change. The stage was set for a revolution that would shake the world. As Paris gathered at the Bastille, its people transformed from a crowd into a determined citizens' army. They formed the National Guard, united by the tricolor cockade, blue and red for Paris, white for the monarchy. Orators inspired hope and rage as the people demanded change. No longer just a crowd, they became an army, ready to seize their future. Around 1:30 in the afternoon, the tense standoff finally broke. No one is entirely sure how it happened. Some say a small group of men, acting on their own, climbed the wall of an outer courtyard and managed to cut the ropes holding up the drawbridge. It came crashing down with a thunderous noise, accidentally killing one person in the crowd. To the masses outside, it seemed like an invitation to enter. They surged forward, pouring into the outer courtyard. The soldiers of the garrison, seeing the fortress breached, panicked. They opened fire on the crowd packed into the small space. The first shots had been fired. The attempt at a peaceful resolution was over. The siege of the Bastille had begun in earnest. The initial assault was chaos. The crowd was a disorganized mass of people armed with little more than courage and fury. They had no clear leader and no real plan. They fired their muskets at the high stone walls, the bullets bouncing harmlessly off the ancient stones. The defenders, firing from the safety of the battlements, had a clear advantage. People in the crowd began to fall, struck down by the garrison's fire. The courtyard became a scene of carnage, filled with the smoke of gunpowder and the cries of the wounded. The initial euphoria of the crowd turned to grim, bloody determination. They were not just fighting for gunpowder anymore. They were fighting for their fallen comrades, for revenge, and for the principle that the people would not be fired upon and ignored. The turning point came with the arrival of the mutinous royal soldiers who had joined the people's cause. They were trained professionals, and they brought the one thing the crowd lacked: cannons. They wheeled their artillery pieces into position, aiming them directly at the main gate of the fortress. This changed the entire dynamic of the fight. It was no longer a civilian mob against a fortified garrison. It was now a proper military siege. The professional soldiers began a systematic bombardment, their cannonballs chipping away at the fortress's defenses. Their presence gave the crowd a new focus and a renewed sense of hope. Victory, which had seemed impossible just an hour before, now felt within their grasp. Inside the fortress, Governor Delaunay was losing control. His veteran soldiers were horrified at being ordered to fire on fellow Frenchmen. They urged him to surrender. His Swiss guards were willing to fight, but they were vastly outnumbered. The governor grew desperate. He knew he could not hold out for long. The crowd was growing larger and more furious with every passing minute. He contemplated a terrible act, lighting the massive stores of gunpowder and blowing up the entire fortress, and a large part of the surrounding neighborhood with it. He was prevented from doing so by his own men. His authority had crumbled. Trapped, with his garrison on the verge of mutiny and cannons battering his gates, Delaunay knew he had no choice. He decided to surrender. Governor Delaunay offered to surrender the Bastille, seeking safe passage for his men. The crowd surged in, conquering the unconquerable. Only 7 prisoners were found, but the real prize was the fortress itself. The king, stunned, realized his power was lost. The fall of the Bastille became a symbol across France and the world of revolution made real. The fall of the Bastille sent shockwaves across France. Peasants, emboldened by hope, rose up, burning feudal charters and storming chateaux. In Versailles, the National Assembly, swept by patriotic fervor, abolished centuries of privilege in a single night. By dawn, the 3 estates were gone. For the first time, all Frenchmen were equal citizens. Revolution had become reality. The National Assembly, inspired by Enlightenment ideals and the American Revolution, drafted the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen in August 1789. It proclaimed, "Men are born and remain free and equal in rights," rejecting the old regime's hierarchy. The Declaration guaranteed liberty, property, security, and resistance to oppression, and established equality before the law. Yet its promises were limited, excluding women slaves and lacking the king's endorsement. Louis XVI refused to accept these new principles, deepening the standoff between monarchy and revolution. The revolution had declared its ideals, but the king would not yield. In October 1789, hunger and outrage drove thousands of Parisian women to march 12 miles to Versailles, demanding bread and action from the king. Armed with kitchen tools and determination, they stormed the National Assembly and confronted Louis XVI. The king promised grain, but the crowd insisted he return to Paris. The next day, the palace was breached. The royal family barely escaped harm. Lafayette calmed the mob, but the demand was clear: the king must move to Paris. Louis XVI agreed, leaving Versailles for good. The revolution had brought the monarchy to the heart of the people. The king's return to Paris marked a shift. He was now a prisoner of the people. The Assembly rapidly reformed France, abolishing old provinces, creating new departments, and seizing church lands. The civil constitution of the clergy split the nation, forcing priests to choose between Rome and the Revolution. Despite growing divisions, the Festival of the Federation in July 1790 celebrated unity and hope for a constitutional monarchy. For a moment, peace seemed possible. But beneath the surface, tensions simmered, threatening to tear France apart. The revolution's next phase loomed. The king, never reconciled to his new role, attempted to flee Paris in June 1791. Recognized and captured in Varennes, the royal family was returned in disgrace. The king's betrayal shattered trust and killed hopes for constitutional monarchy. Calls for a republic surged, with radicals like Danton and Robespierre gaining influence. Tensions erupted at the Champ de Mars, where the National Guard fired on protesters demanding the king's abdication. The massacre deepened divisions among revolutionaries. The revolution's path now led towards bloodshed and terror. In 1792, fear and paranoia swept Paris as France faced invasion and the monarchy crumbled. The king and queen were imprisoned and the revolution turned violent. The guillotine became a symbol of terror. In January 1793, Louis XVI was executed before a stunned crowd. The king's death sent shockwaves across Europe. There was no turning back. The revolution had burned its bridges to the old world. With the king dead and France at war, the National Convention faced crisis. The Jacobins, led by Robespierre, seized control and created the Committee of Public Safety, unleashing the Reign of Terror. Their goal, a republic of virtue, purged of corruption, enforced by the guillotine. Anyone suspected of disloyalty, even for complaining about bread, could be arrested. Paranoia ruled. A careless word could mean a midnight knock and a one-way trip to the guillotine. In Paris, executions became daily spectacle. Hope and liberty gave way to fear and death. By the spring of 1794, the French armies were winning. But in Paris, the bloodshed only intensified. Robespierre, obsessed with purity, saw enemies everywhere. The revolution, once a fight for freedom, now tolerated no dissent. Rivals like Danton fell to the guillotine. The Great Terror spiraled until Robespierre himself was arrested and executed. The Reign of Terror was finally over. The fall of Robespierre on that hot July day brought an immediate and profound sense of relief. As the news spread through Paris, it was as if the entire city could finally exhale after holding its breath for a year. The Reign of Terror was over. The endless cycle of denunciations, arrests, and executions came to a sudden halt. The prisons were opened, and thousands of political prisoners who had been expecting to face the guillotine at any moment were set free. They emerged blinking into the sunlight, spectral figures returning from the brink of death. The public mood shifted dramatically. The severe puritanical atmosphere of Robespierre's Republic of Virtue evaporated, replaced by a wave of hedonism and a desperate desire to forget the horrors and enjoy life once more. France was a nation utterly exhausted. It was exhausted by years of constant upheaval, by war, by hunger, and by fear. The relentless revolutionary fervor had burned itself out, leaving behind a deep sense of disillusionment. So many of the revolution's brightest stars had been devoured by their own creation. The great orators, the radical journalists, the political leaders, most were now dead, victims of the very terror they had helped to unleash. The grand ideals of 1789, the promise of liberty, equality, and fraternity, seemed like a distant memory tainted by the blood of the guillotine. The people of France were weary of political turmoil. They longed for stability, for order, and for an end to the chaos that had consumed their lives for 5 long years. The Thermidorian reaction, as this new period was called, was a retreat from the radicalism of the Jacobins. The surviving members of the convention, mostly moderates who had survived the terror by keeping their heads down, were now in charge. They dismantled the machinery of the terror, repealing the law of 22 Prairial and closing the Jacobin Club. They sought to create a more conservative republic, one that would be safe for men of property and that would prevent the rise of another dictator like Robespierre. This new government, known as the Directory, was a fragile and corrupt regime, lurching from one crisis to another. It failed to solve the country's deep economic problems and was plagued by plots from both royalists on the right and surviving Jacobins on the left. For ordinary people like Jean-Pierre and his family, life remained a struggle. The end of the Terror did not mean an end to their hardships. The political instability in Paris meant that the economy remained in shambles. Inflation was rampant, and the price of bread was still a daily concern. While the threat of the guillotine had receded, the future felt uncertain and precarious. The great hopes that had been born in 1789 had been tempered by the harsh realities of revolution. They had seen their world turned upside down, their feudal burdens lifted, but they had also lived through a period of unimaginable fear. They were freer than their parents had been, but they were also more cynical, more wary of grand promises and political saviors. The weak and unstable Directory government could not last. France craved a strong leader who could restore order, end the political squabbling, and consolidate the gains of the revolution. That leader was waiting in the wings. He was a young, brilliant, and incredibly ambitious general named Napoleon Bonaparte. He had made a name for himself defending the revolution and leading the French armies to stunning victories in Italy and Egypt. In 1799, he saw his chance. Returning to France as a national hero, he staged a coup d'etat, overthrowing the Directory government. The French Revolution, in its active, chaotic phase, was over. 10 years of tumultuous change had come to an end, not with a stable republic, but with the rise of a new military dictator. Napoleon's rise seemed to be the very thing the revolution had fought to prevent, the concentration of power in the hands of a single, all-powerful man. He would eventually crown himself emperor, creating a new kind of monarchy. And yet, Napoleon was not a king of the old regime. He was a product of the revolution, a man who had risen through talent, not birth. He preserved many of the revolution's most important changes. He created the Napoleonic Code, a single unified legal system for all of France that enshrined the principle of legal equality for all male citizens. He centralized the state, reformed the education system, and established the Bank of France. He brought the stability and order that the French people so desperately craved. Looking back from the vantage point of Napoleon's rule, our peasant, Jean-Pierre, would have seen a world utterly transformed. He was no longer a serf, bound to the land and subservient to a local lord. He was a citizen of France, a landowner in his own right, equal to any other man before the law. The hated feudal dues and church tithes were gone forever. His sons would not be judged by their ancestry but could, like Napoleon himself, rise on the strength of their own abilities. These were real, tangible, and permanent gains. The revolution had been a terrifying and bloody journey, but it had unshackled him and millions like him from the chains of the past. The world of 1788, with its gilded cages and its starving masses, was gone for good. But the cost had been immense. The dream of a democratic republic, where the people themselves would be sovereign, had died. The radical experiment in popular government had descended into terror and had been succeeded by dictatorship. The promise of liberty had been curtailed in the name of order. Freedom of the press was suppressed under Napoleon, and political opposition was silenced. The revolution had shown that the road from absolute monarchy to a stable, free society was fraught with peril. It had unleashed both the noblest aspirations for human freedom and the darkest capacities for human cruelty. The final lesson for France was a complex and often contradictory one, a story of immense progress achieved at a terrible price. The legacy of the French Revolution extends far beyond the borders of France. It was a historical earthquake that sent shockwaves across the globe, and its tremors are still felt today. It was the event that, more than any other, marked the beginning of the modern world. The revolution's core ideas, liberty, equality, and fraternity, became a new political gospel for humanity. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen provided a blueprint for movements for independence and constitutional reform across Europe and the Americas in the 19th century. It challenged the legitimacy of every monarchy and every aristocracy on the planet. After 1789, the world would never be the same again. Kings and emperors everywhere trembled, knowing their own people had seen what happened in France. The revolution introduced a new and powerful force into the world: nationalism. Before, people's loyalties were primarily local, to their village, their lord, or their province. The revolution created the idea of the French nation, a single people bound together by a common language, culture, and a shared commitment to a set of political ideals. It was this powerful new sense of national identity that allowed France to raise huge citizen armies and conquer much of Europe under Napoleon. In response, the peoples that France conquered, the Spanish, the Germans, the Italians, developed their own sense of national identity in opposition to French rule. The Age of Nations, which would define global politics for the next 2 centuries, was born in the fires of the French Revolution. The revolution also defined the modern political spectrum. The terms left-wing and right-wing originated in the French National Assembly, where the radical Jacobins sat to the left of the president's chair, and the conservative monarchists sat to the right. This division between those who want to push for radical change and those who want to conserve traditional institutions has remained the fundamental organizing principle of politics ever since. Debates over the role of government, the rights of the individual, the meaning of social equality, and the place of religion in public life are all echoes of the great arguments that first erupted in revolutionary Paris. The revolution put these questions on the table for the entire world, and we are still debating them today. Ultimately, the French Revolution is a timeless and universal human story. It is a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked power, social inequality, and how noble ideals can be twisted to justify horrific violence. It is also an inspirational story about the power of ordinary people to demand their rights and to fundamentally reshape their world. For Jean-Pierre, the fictional peasant who witnessed it all, the final feeling might have been one of weary hope. He had seen the best and worst of humanity. He had gained his freedom, but lost his innocence. His hope would be that his children and grandchildren would live in a world that remembered the revolution's promise of equality and liberty, but never forgot the terrible cost of the terror. That is its enduring lesson for us all.